Greetings, everyone, and welcome to today's editorial webcast, Build a Solid Foundation for Password Protection. This event is sponsored by Specops and presented by Redmond Magazine. My name is Leif Lowe. I'll be your moderator for today's event. Thank you all again for joining us. Well, despite the frequent news stories you see about cyber attacks and data breaches, which are most often facilitated by attackers getting around weak passwords, many enterprise users are still unaware of effective password controls. You certainly don't want your company dominating the headlines, but it can seem like an uphill battle to get the user community in line with stronger password policies. But don't worry, all is not lost. You can strengthen your password infrastructure so you can remain compliant. Remaining compliant will be your user's only option. You can establish compliance requirements, set up blacklists, defend against dictionary attacks, ensure NIST compliance, and reduce the overall burden on your users. Well, during our editorial webcast today, our expert speakers will be describing what you can do behind the scenes to make your password protocols as strong as possible while preventing your users from circumventing those policies. Today you'll learn more about enforcing password policy compliance, blacklisting ineffective or compromised passwords, creating policies that your users won't try to circumvent. All right, before we get rolling, I just have to run through a few housekeeping items. If you would like to submit a question at any time today, which we strongly encourage you to do, just look for the question field to the left of the slide window. Type your question in there and hit submit, and we will get to as many of those as we can at the end of the presentation. Also, today's webcast is being recorded and archived for future viewing. Starting tomorrow, you can access the replay using the same link you used today to view it again or pass along and share with a colleague. Now I'd like to introduce today's speakers. Later in the presentation, we'll be hearing from Darren James from Specops Software. Darren has more than 20 years of experience in IT. He's worked as a consultant across many sectors and many different size organizations, everything from central and local governments to retail and energy companies. His specialties are Active Directory, Azure AD, and group policy. He's worked at Specops for nearly 10 years. Our featured speaker today is Nick Cavalancia. Nick has more than 25 years of enterprise IT experience and is a Microsoft Cloud and Data Center MVP with a strong focus on cybersecurity. He's an accomplished consultant, speaker, trainer, writer, and columnist. He has earned Microsoft's MCSE, MCT, Master CNE, and Master CNI certifications. He has authored, co-authored, and contributed to nearly 24 books and regularly speaks, writes, and blogs for some of the most recognized tech companies on a variety of topics. Good to have you back again, Nick.
Indeed. Always a pleasure, Leif. Thanks for having me.
All right. Well, today, Nick and I will be discussing some of the factors and best practices around how to establish and maintain an effective password policy. Well, thanks again for joining us today. Now, Nick, let's begin our exploration around some of these critical issues around password policies.
Sure.
We're getting started from the ground up, starting with the basics. What would you say, Nick, are some of the fundamental and really most effective aspects of a solid password policy?
So the first aspect that I would probably want to mention is the user themselves. They are prone to be predictable, habitual, generally disinterested in maintaining organizational security, that sort of thing. So whatever the policy is that you're going to put in place, you have to take into consideration how the user is going to react and in some cases circumvent the policy, which I think we'll talk about a little later on as well.
Yeah,
so I think that's sort of the overarching thing that should be thought of. Now, having said that, there are kind of four basic aspects to a password policy that, as I see it, some are good, some are bad, some are more important, some are less important. The first one is length. And longer is always going to be better. It adds to the number of permutations possible and so on. Harder to crack it and that sort of thing. Complexity. Now, complexity, when it's mixed with length, is better. If it's just simply saying, using a very short password that's very complex, then it's not. That's a lot easier to guess. So if you're like, well, I have a 6-character password, but it's complex. That's not as good as having, let's say, a regularly formed kind of sentence, if you will, in the English language, and I think I've got an example I'll use a little later on. So complexity does come into play, but it has to be used appropriately to actually benefit.
Right.
The third one is duration. Now, expiration of passwords, at least as a general practice, is pretty much dead. Microsoft stopped recommending it. It was last year sometime. The functionality still exists inside Windows, but they stopped recommending it. And it's mostly because kind of the very first aspect I mentioned, the user. If we simply told people every 30 days to change their password, they changed it from, I don't know, let's say their dog's name is Muffy, and it went from Muffy 1 to Muffy 2 to Muffy 3 to Muffy 4. That's all they did. It doesn't matter. But duration does have a place in password policies, particularly when it comes to elevated permissioned accounts. So you're not necessarily just like your domain admins and enterprise admins, but but it could be even anyone that service accounts, someone that's got access to particular sensitive data in the organization. I mean, this is where you start getting into conversations where you have things like privileged access management solutions like the password vaults, and they typically have like password rotation that come into place. Every time the password gets used, it gets rotated when it's checked back in. So when you think of it going down that path, that being sort of, let's call that the end game. It's not the end game, but that's the one end of the spectrum where you definitely have password rotation. It demonstrates that duration of passwords actually does have a play. But generally speaking, even Microsoft has said, if no one has ever hacked your password or compromised your account, then your password's secure. So what's the point in making you change it? And that's pretty viable, but at the same time, you have to measure that with risk and decide for certain kinds of elevated accounts, maybe we do want to change the password more often just to make sure. And then the last one is the user or the role that the user has within the organization. And that goes back to that issue of risk, trying to figure out what risk a given user has based on their position, their role, their department, their title, what data they have access to, those kinds of things. And then you apply all the other factors in kind of based off of that risk. So then the last part I think I'd mention here is not just finding one policy, but a set of policies that align with the given levels of risk. So that's a long-winded answer, but I hope it helps.
Sure, yeah. And it sounds like none of those factors are sufficient or any more or less important on their own. Like you said, complexity and length kind of have to work together. They have to work in concert.
Agreed. Yeah, agreed.
Yeah. All right. Now, I mean, it's a slight follow-up question here. I mean, I can't imagine any organization not having a password policy, but if a company is just starting out, what are some of the first steps they should take? I mean, you mentioned the focus on the user.
Okay. The simple blocking and tackling, do something. Put in something in place, right? I would agree. I can't imagine any of our audience. I'm assuming all of you have a password policy of even 8 characters. Maybe you still have, having to have it changed every 30 or 60 days. I mean, you have something in place that's a whole lot better than having nothing and just letting users type in whatever they want. But at a minimum, come up with one basic policy. Even what's built in with Windows, you could put in length and some complexity and it decide if you want duration or something. Put something in place. So, I mean, that's the really obvious answer, and I'm hoping that it applies to absolutely no one on the call today. But if it does, put something in place to at least protect yourself, and then go through the rest of the aspects of assessing what you need to be doing for a password policy based on risk within the organization.
Yep. All right. Okay. Moving along, I mean, it certainly sounds like these factors have to work together. I mean, it certainly seems to be a combination of policy, processes, and then, of course, the technology you're putting in place. How should all these factors best work together to really create and support a stronger policy?
That's a good question. So in concept, we sort of have the policy established. I'm going to put that aside. Like we sort of did that in the first question, so to speak, right? So let's assume we've got policy or policies, at least a definition of roles. We know what we want to do to who we want to secure, how much more we need them to be secure than somebody else, and so on. So, then it becomes a question of, the process and technology being what's going to make or break this. I mean, the adoption becomes really key here. And so you have to figure out how are we going to implement this in a way that users want to accept the new policy. I mean, think about that for a second here. They have to really not just, they're not going to ever want it, right? No one's ever going to want it, but they want to have to at least accept the policy.
Yep. Accept that that's a business necessity.
Right. This can be a little difficult because who actually wants to go from a password of, let's say I've got a kid named Stuart who was born in 2005, and who wants to go from a password of Stuart 2005, pretty easy to remember, right, to think about this sentence in being grammatically correct, having the right capitalization, the right punctuation, everything. Going from Stuart 2005 to, of all my children, comma, Stuart is my number one, that is #1, number one kid, period, right? That's a long sentence. So no user really wants to do that. So I rather than it being, maybe I don't have an answer where I say just do X and it becomes really easy. I think the idea is you have to find a process and probably a partnering technology, more than likely third-party from Microsoft, that is going to provide a means of implementing where users are also educated on why this is important. I mean, they're still going to comply no matter what, but you want them to go along with the process and understand why it's important, which would hopefully lower some barriers. Of course, I'm speaking in real rose-colored glasses kind of a mentality, because what user really wants to type in that long, phrase that I just gave.
Right.
But even so, I think they've got to understand why they're going from one to the other. Otherwise, they're like, how am I supposed to do this? And they're just going to simply make it, of all my children, Stuart is my number 2 kid, my number 3 kid, my number 4 kid. They're just going to find another way to do the same thing over and over again. So it becomes kind of important.
Yeah, at least get them to embrace the importance of it. And maybe they feel like they're, part of the security protocols. They're helping.
Hey, that's exactly it, and I think that's you talked about policy, process, and technology. In some ways, it also is, and the user has to be part of the security, security stance of the organization, and they have to learn to do that. That's why you like security awareness training coming up and things like that, and phishing being one of the most highly used attack vectors, just because users aren't thinking in terms of security, so they really need to be doing that. I think it becomes part of it, but the other part is making sure that you've got a piece of technology that's going to make the implementing as easy as possible, the onboarding and that sort of thing as easy as possible, so that users do want to adopt it and want to use it. Yeah.
I mean, you think of it in terms of physical security. If someone saw someone breaking into their company, they're not going to sit there and do nothing. They're going to call 911. They want to be part of it. So.
Agreed.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that kind of rolls nicely in the next question. How should an organization best kind of communicate their password policy and really make sure those users are indeed embracing it and following it?
Twofold, I think. The technology is going to be responsible for ensuring the compliance portion, like the simple stuff of like, we've all heard the joking thing of like, your password is not complex enough, must use an uppercase and lowercase and special character. That the compliance thing will handle itself. The communication goes back to the education. I think IT organizations have to make sure they're expressing to users well before the adoption ever happens some kind of communication that says we're going to be changing our password policies. These are the reasons why. Now, no user's going to be like, yay, hooray, and you're not going to have balloons and confetti, and no one's going to love this thing, right? They're all going to begrudgingly comply. That'd be a given. But at least if they understand, then they'll put some effort into it, maybe, versus just going, how do I circumvent? And that being their first line of thinking here. Right. So users have to understand that through some sort of, education. And it doesn't have to be anything formal. This could literally just be an email going out from IT reminding them, but I would recommend doing it before they're emotionally connected to doing the new, or utilizing the new system. Because now they're like, this thing sucks. It's asking me all these questions and all this onboarding. So do it before they ever have any emotional investment, and they just go, okay, we're going to be changing it, and they understand why, and they've sort of emotionally accepted that part of it.
Right.
And then now we get to the second half, which is understanding, what the compliance is going to look like. What are the mandates that are necessary for the different policies, for the different roles, and that kind of thing. And then the users can start to actually formulate what they need to come up with as a password. And I think also helping them understand what a really good password would look like would be helpful. Even if you did say, if you're used to using Stuart 2005, we recommend instead using the of all my children, Stuart is my number 1 kid, period. And say that's the more secure password. Yeah, one you can actually use. So I think the communication is more about the devil's in the details, and the compliance with the password policies becomes a little easier because the technology is just going to review and make sure you're doing it right.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So that's process and technology truly working together. Indeed.
Agreed.
All right. Now getting a little bit deeper into how that technology works. things like blacklists and dictionaries of compromised passwords. How effective are these? How effective are blacklists of ineffective or compromised passwords, or these available dictionaries of kind of commonplace or easy to crack passwords?
Well, so I think that the idea of using the blacklist, it's a necessary first step in the process. So I think most everybody's probably aware of like the Have I Been Pwned website that came out. I think that was probably the first step where most IT folks really realized the problem. We always known the problem. We always knew that, Jeff from accounting just, had like, it was written down on a piece of paper or something, and it was like, name of his dog and his year he was born or something. That really simple kind of passwords. But I think that seeing it out there and seeing there's a database of like common passwords, and we've started to see year over year the most used passwords of like password 1234 or 12345678 and those kinds of things. You go, well, it's really a bad problem. Okay, now we got to do something about it. So I mean, to the point where like NIST actually has an open API where they check against 550 million bad passwords. So if you're utilizing, some kind of your own internal, process that's going to check against, blacklist, there's a huge blacklist. It's totally free. You can do that. But as far as effectiveness goes, going back to your question here, I think that they help eliminate sort of what I would call the obvious security risk. 1 through 8 as a password is not a password. It's just a random set of numbers. What was it? Who is the rapper that was at the White House, or was it not Kanye West? It was somebody else in there. Their phone code was like 5 zeros, and everyone saw them type it open. That's horrible security. That's not even secure. One, don't put your phone near a camera. But two, all zeros doesn't make any sense. But so they would help eliminate that. But then you need to have methods of ensuring compliance to those length, those complexity requirements, that kind of thing. That's the additional necessity. So it's not that they are ineffective or effective as a blacklist, but on their own, they're effective at least getting rid of the obvious stuff, but that can't be the only way you're gonna secure your environment.
Yeah. And perhaps there's a little bit of educational value in those as well. Some people see examples of bad passwords and they'll know what not to do. Perhaps.
Agreed. Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense from the standpoint of if you're going to educate the users along the way. And I don't know how. I don't know if a solution that does this. I'm not saying they don't exist. SpecOps might even do it. I have no clue. But it might be something along the lines where they type in a password. If someone was actually look at the password and go, okay, that's a horrible password. Let me tell you why. That would be nice to have in there. I don't know if that actually exists, but that certainly would be. It would help educate the user along the way so they start forming good habits, and then that makes the environment more secure and actually demonstrates some value for whatever product it is. So I guess Darren, if you guys don't have that feature, you should have the checkbox for tell the user why this is a horrible password option, and then explain to them afterwards. But
I'll take that on board. I'll take that on board, Nick.
Yeah, please.
Sounds good. All right. Well, you mentioned NIST there briefly, Nick. How important is compliance with the NIST password standards? And are those legal requirements, or is that just simply a guideline? What the government thinks you should do.
Good question. Let's talk about which one specifically I'm talking about. So they've got a publication, 800-63. Typically, everybody focuses on 800-63B, and that's the one that's got a lot of information around the topic of. It's mostly about authentication, so passwords come into play, but it's not a set of guidelines that say here's the password standards you must use, because they're not. Also, I should actually note, to answer your second question, these aren't regulations. These aren't government standard requirements.
They're not going to come after us if we don't use them.
No, there are no NIST police, at least not that I know of, that come after anybody. And this is more of like an opportunity to adhere to some accepted best practices, and they are really good, well detailed, very technical best practices. So you guys in the audience, if you haven't read. You can look up NIST 800-63B. It'll come right up. You can read the publication, and when you read it, it's very techy. It's very detailed. It's not vendor specific, so that's good, but it does give a lot of guidelines. So they do talk about passwords, which in the document, the publication, they call memorized secrets. But so for those of you that are relying on just say passwords for authentication, the other thing that it's going to do for you by reading this document is it's going to kind of open your eyes to the world of multi-factor authentication and the various means by which you can, let's call it alternatively, and in most cases probably more securely authenticate a user. There's different levels of authentication assurance. And that kind of ties back to my previous statement about different users have different levels of risk within the organization. And so if you have, let's say, authentication assurance level 1, you only need one factor technically, and the password is acceptable. Yep. And so you're meeting one of the guidelines. You write just because you have passwords for everybody. Most people got a password, right? Guest isn't blank or whatever. But then it goes on and opens your eyes to a number of other various ways that you can authenticate somebody, as well as I think in a lot of cases some of those same methodologies could be used if you are reliant on passwords for doing things like password self-service. If you have a password self-service solution, the same kinds of methods of authenticating that you're could be utilized in that other situation as well. So both for authenticating to log on and authenticating in the case of a password reset. So,
yep. Okay. Sounds good. Now, besides what NIST recommends, are there any other protocols or password frameworks that, specific to other industries or any other things that the company should pay attention to?
I do like the one from the Center for Internet Security, CIS, and they've got some recommendations that for the most part are just simply reinforcing what NIST has said. They have a couple of other things that they add in, but just to kind of, I wrote down a couple of them in front of me. I've got some notes here. That they recommend use of 14 characters as a minimum. Different passwords for every account that you access, which I'm a big fan of because people tend to use, what was the average? Oh, there was a report that was not too long ago. It was something like on average people have the same password across at least 6 accounts, something like that, and then across work and home, which makes it really dangerous. That kind of don't take that quote to the bank, but it was something like that. It was pretty bad. Yeah. They have another one which I do like, which is don't allow password managers to store passwords. There's been some really good examples of late. A ransomware called FT Code just got an update a month or two ago, and it includes now a set of PowerShell-based code that goes after every major browser and an Outlook, full-blown Outlook on a desktop, and it'll actually decrypt all of your passwords stored in browsers. And the idea why it's tied, I love this. I mean, it's brilliant from a ransomware perspective because now think about it. If I'm the ransomware author, I'm going to probably steal some of your data to do the whole extortion thing to make sure you pay the ransom. I'll post it up online if you don't pay me. 2, I'm going to lock out you from all your data and your systems. 3, I'm going to then lock you out. I'm going to go into every system that I have a password for in an automated fashion and change the password to every system. So now you're locked out from every system that I got the password for off your browser. And one of those is more than likely probably the email that's the recovery email for all the other systems. So
exactly.
This is like, and this has disaster written all over it. So
it does.
I'm a big fan of that as well. They also mention things like don't share your password, which sounds kind of like what? Who would do that? But there was there was a password study. Oh, I wish I had it off the top of my head. I could find it. Maybe I can find it by the time the Q&A comes up after Darren does his thing. But it was something like even like 50-something% of IT pros still shared their password with other IT pros. Geez. It was really kind of scary. And then the last thing they mentioned in there is using multi-factor authentication, which ties back to NIST, talking about the different authentication assurance levels and that sort of thing. So having some level of multi-factor, not just two-factor, multi-factor authentication, more than 2 necessary. So that'd be the other kind of recommendation I think that I would add in is the one from the Center for Internet Security.
Okay. Definitely worth checking out. Sounds good. Oh, yeah, I'm definitely, we were talking about the people using the same passwords for different accounts. I'm certainly guilty of that and should pay better attention to that. I think they call that password sloth. So, yeah, I need to be better with that. All right. Well, getting back to the users, we've talked about a lot of great strategies and tactics here. How can we really, truly ensure the users won't circumvent any of the password policies they find a little too challenging or confusing?
That's where I started kind of with this at the very beginning. So that exact reason it's going to happen. There's always, the idea of shadow IT, which I think has sort of died as a concept. We don't really talk about it much, only because it's now just the state of the union. It's people always do that unless IT is going to find a solution. So it's not like this. Are you watching out for it? It just exists everywhere now.
Yeah.
Users are smart enough to figure out and find something. So this just really, it comes down to the technology that you talked about: policy, process, technology. I added people. It comes down to the technology part. Having the right solution in place that's going to mandate this is the only way that users can't circumvent it. I mean, you'll get access to your data then. So something that's tied into your identity store, whether it's on-premises AD or something that's tied into Azure AD or Office 365 or whatever you're using, or something, you have it something that's going to be tied in with that to make sure that users are going to have to utilize this. And it's one of the reasons that I use the word begrudgingly beforehand, because they are going to have to begrudgingly go with it. They're not going to yay, let's put in different passwords and let's change it. Let's make sure they're really long and complex. No one wants to do that. They want to do accounting or payroll or marketing. They don't want to worry about, that's your problem. You guys secure it. And so you're going to have to make them. And so I really think that's the only way to do this, is to ensure that both the resources they need to access are tied within, which is a whole bigger conversation, because now we're talking about potentially cloud apps as well as on-premises apps, and having an identity store that might be on-premises with Active Directory, or might be in the cloud with Azure AD, or might be something else that's third party. I mean, it can get really convoluted now, but make sure that all the resources, applications, data, everything falls underneath and subject to whatever identity store you're putting this kind of solution in play with. That'd be the first thing. And then the second part is, again, using a technology solution that's going to make sure that you have the right requirements for the given users based on risk.
Right. And have all those factors properly supporting each other, for sure. For sure. All right. What are some of the common mistakes you see companies make when they're setting up their password policies?
Common mistakes would be probably the issue of risk, not addressing the risk issue. And simply thinking about it from a technology standpoint, the biggest change that I've seen, the biggest shift in the way that IT has had to operate in the last 5 years, is the shift that is to start with the business and work towards technology. Having been in IT for 25 years, my very first, I worked on NetWare 2.2 on a 286 in non-dedicated mode. Go figure, that's how long ago I go. And then with Windows, it was Windows for Workgroups and NT3.1, right? So, and we always were, and you guys in the audience, we're all kindred spirits. We love the technology. We're like, oh, this is so cool. I could lock this down, or I could implement this, or I could make users be able to connect from there. And we get excited about the things that the technology can afford us, allow us to do. But then what we tend to forget is we have to start with the business and what are the business needs, and work back to the technology in order to do this. So that's what I think where the common mistake is to say, I can put in 3 password policies. Great, let's come up with 3 different levels. No. Start with literally getting your executives, maybe even your board, asking how granular they want it to be. You may have to get line of business owners, department heads, and you may have to come up with and figure out what are the levels of risk and then assess that. It's the same kind of process you would do for if you're doing like business continuity and disaster recovery. You'd be figuring out tiers of applications and so on. If you were worried about, let's say, insider threats, you'd be looking at risk levels of the different levels of insider threats and deciding, am I going to be just monitoring them with, let's say, user behavior analytics, or am I actually going to monitor everything they do with user activity monitoring and watching every keystroke and so on? It's all based on risk. And so I think that's the most common mistake, is not starting with the business, working towards establishing what the levels of risk are, and then figuring out how to make the technology meet the need. You have to define the need for your organization and meet the need with technology.
Yeah, and truly build it from the ground up, for sure.
Yep.
For sure. All right, that's about wraps up our conversation here. Any other thoughts you have? Any other considerations around password policies that you think we haven't touched on? Anything you want to add?
I would say this. I want to reinforce the idea that multi-factor authentication is going to likely be your next step. And I'm a big believer in multi-factor authentication, all the way down to and including, let's say, figure out whoever the lowest level person is that has access to a computer in your organization. I always use the example of the person in the mailroom. Not because I'm trying to belittle them, but I'm just thinking from a technology standpoint, they need a computer with like the UPS website on it, a label printer, that kind of thing, and maybe they have access to email. Well, even that person needs multi-factor authentication, because if their credentials become compromised, well, they're like, Nick, they don't have access to anything. What am I worried about them for? Well, they could use their email. A hacker can get in, compromise their credential, use their email, and send an email out to everybody in the organization saying, hey, a package has arrived. Click here for information on this package and make sure this is yours, and then you can come down and fill out this form or whatever, and you click a link because you want to get the package. You don't know what package it is. You click the link, find out what it is. Now you got malware on your machine. I make it sound really easy, of course, for the hacker, but that's the idea. So everyone should be using it. And then the other thing is, eventually you're going to be thinking about going passwordless to a degree, and that's through multi-factor authentication. So again, whether we're talking about authenticating or maybe it's password reset or something, having the additional factors is what's going to allow for your organization, for you guys in the audience, multiple ways to identify an individual. So in some cases, ways that are even more familiar to the user, something like, let's say, they use, let's say, Google Auth as an example. So it's great. You put your password in, to Azure AD. And that's great. That's one way, but let me go ahead and have you use Google Auth and authenticate through Google because you have a Gmail account. Well, that's something the user does all day long anyways when they read their email at Gmail anyways. So it's something very familiar to them. So there's lots of ways to do things where it doesn't have to be cumbersome for the user. I always like to say the best security is the one that the user doesn't know about, if possible. Right? And this is something where it feels a little more like, hey, that thing you already do, like you log into Facebook, hey, could you do that please? And then we know that it's actually you. And those kind of things. So think MFA a little bit, but, while we have passwords, be thinking about making sure they're secure at various levels to meet the needs of the organization. So I hope that helps.
Yep. Absolutely. Definitely helps. Yeah, thank you very much, Nick. Those are some great insights and some great tactics and action items for our listeners to take back. All right, moving right along here, I'd like to now hand things over to Darren James, who will tell us a little bit more about SpecOps' take on building a solid password policy. Take it away, Darren.
Thanks very much, Leif and Nick. It was a very good and interesting conversation that we heard there. So looks like we both clicked the next button at the same time. So, I'm going to talk about the SpecOps password solutions that we have available from SpecOps software. We are a company, well, I'll tell you a little bit about me. In fact, Leif's already spoken about me, so we'll skip that slide. So a little bit about SpecOps. We're a privately owned company. We've been founded back nearly 20 years now, 19 years. Thousands of customers all over the world. Offices in Sweden, where our head office is, the UK, where I'm based, Germany, United States, and Canada. And we produce solutions for password management and desktop management. Password management is obviously what we're all here to talk about today. And really, I'm kind of going to build on a lot of what Nick's just talked about, and I wanted to talk about sort of the three major types of cyber attacks that we see today. So there are a few sort of common attack vectors that we see a lot of. Things like credential stuffing, where it's kind of relying on our users reusing their passwords across multiple sites. And this is one of the things that I'm always a little bit concerned about when people talk about saying, well, we want to set our users' passwords to never expire. Because unfortunately, users, if you tell them that they've got to come up with an amazing passphrase and that's the best thing that they're ever going to do, they'll then think to themselves, well, I've just been told this is an amazing passphrase, so I'm going to use it on my Gmail and my LinkedIn and my Twitter and my Facebook and their Dunkin' Donuts or supermarket reward card points account, that kind of thing. And it only takes one of those other systems to then get compromised for that amazing passphrase to be then out in the open. And of course, if they have used it with their work account or with another account that's tied to their work ID, then you're then vulnerable to those credential stuffing attacks. So I always try and, talk to people around those sorts of risks when they talk about passwords never expiring. I think it's quite dangerous advice that we get from NIST and the NCSC, the UK kind of equivalent of NIST, when they talk about that. And I think you can only really put those sorts of never expire options in when you've got some very good SIEM solution that can detect unusual successful logins. So if you've always logged in from a certain laptop or a certain iPad or home computer to your work system, they are a trusted source. That's fine. But suddenly, if there's a login from North Korea or from a weird Linux box, and it's a successful login, not a failed login, a successful login, then those sorts of things need to be flagged. If you've got that sort of system in place, great. Then switch on password never expires. But unless you have something like that in place, I don't always think it's a good idea. Of course, the other things like that or similar to that are credential spraying. So where someone will take a username that's linked rather than a paired username and password, which is what credential stuffing is all about. They'll take a username and then use it with a list of passwords that they may have used in the past. So again, with all of these web portal, Office 365, all of these systems, all these web apps that are available these days, it's very easy for someone to launch a slow burn attack on your users' accounts. So they'll do enough tries with the wrong passwords or with their lists of passwords so that they don't lock the account out. But and then they'll retry the day after, after the user successfully logged in, let's say. So again, we have to be wary about all of those sorts of attacks as well. And of course, we've got phishing attacks, or social engineering attacks, I should say. So where people, fraudsters, are trying to gain information about your users, whether it's their passwords or maybe answers to secret questions, which they may then use to try and reset that user's password if you've got a publicly facing self-service reset system. So all of those sorts of things you have to bear in mind with as well. And of course, phishing attacks where, someone's pretending to be someone else. Nick's example of the guy in the mailroom sending emails out. Oh, yeah, I know Darren from the mailroom. I'll click on that link. He's a trustworthy guy. You always have to be careful of those as well. So that's really good advice that Nick gave out there. But ultimately, the password is the biggest risk that's facing a lot of organizations today, especially in this sort of web-based, cloud-based environment that a lot of organizations are moving to. So we need to try and limit that risk. And MFA is a great thing. If we can get everybody to put MFA support into their applications, then that's an awesome thing to try and move towards. But unfortunately, at the moment, passwords are still the most prevalent form of security out there, and they're not having an MFA platform isn't always available. So, as we've still got this problem in hand, we still need to deal with it some way, and that's really where SpecOps comes in. And just a little bit of more notes about, again, what Nick and Leif were talking about. When we're implementing a password policy, we should always focus on the users. Find out what the business requirements are. Train your users. All of this comes with education. You can't just enforce a password policy and expect them to get on with it. You need to tell them what makes a good password or a good passphrase, ultimately, and not just a random sentence. It shouldn't be the first line of a song or the title of a film or a famous quote. I kind of like the UK government's approach to this, and that is picking out 3 random words. So 3 words with at least 6 characters in each word that means something to you but nothing to anybody else. And I think that's a great way of getting a very long, simple and easy to type passphrase into your organization or for your users to adopt. And if you go with that approach, that's a great way of getting them to adopt those passphrase requirements. And there are some other tricks that you can have up your sleeve as well. Things like rewarding users for setting longer passwords. So if they set a 9 to 14 character password because it's so easy to crack, then maybe force them to change it every 45 days. But if they set a 15 to 20 character password, let them keep it for a year. Or if you've got that amazing SIEM solution that I was talking in place, then maybe set it to never expire if they set over a 15 character password or /passphrase. So think about, trying to reward people when coming up with your password policy. Give them something back is always a good thing to have as well. And really that all boils down to the technical controls. What can we do today with the built-in tools? Well, the answer is not a lot. You don't have any power to look at dictionaries in Active Directory. There are very few other systems. Office 365 and Azure AD has some native kind of lookups of their own systems, but they're all shrouded, and you can't use, your company name, for instance, to stop your users blocking those passwords in Azure AD. So we have to look at these third-party tools that can help us. And again, That's exactly what SpecOps password policy provides. And these are, three common examples. Enforce password policies that balances usability and security. So again, what Nick was talking about with regards to roles, not just admins and users, but all of the shades in between, service accounts, people that work in finance or HR or in the legal team. They all may have different requirements. And you have, other things like PCI DSS, the payment card industry standards. Their rules are very different to what NIST recommends. So you may have to implement a different policy for people that might handle credit card payments within your organization. So all of those sorts of things you need to take into account. And again, like we say on point 3 there, multi-factor is always the way to go if it's available. So yeah, what can SpecOps do to help you? Well, we have a number of products that fit into this password management arena. So SpecOps Password Auditor up the top there is a free tool, and I'll give you a little demo of that in a couple of slides' time. In fact, the next slide, to show you how big the problem is in your organization today. So if we've got complex passwords, 8 or 9 characters in length, mustn't contain the username, password history of 24, then that we think we're great. But of course, that's password 1 with a capital P is a perfectly good password. So, and it's all of those sorts of leaked passwords that SpecOps Password Auditor can tell you if they currently exist in your environment. Then once we've identified that problem, then we can look at enforcing some better rules or controls within our organization. That doesn't necessarily mean we have to make it harder for the user. As I say, we can use SpecOps password policy to come up with these variable length aging requests for expiry to give something back to the user. We can give the users a choice between a horribly complex password or a nice, simple but long passphrase. All of those sorts of things are tied up with SpecOps password policy. And then we've got password blacklist. So I think Nick already mentioned, have I been pwned? And I think Troy's done a great job in producing that website and compiling that database with nearly 500 million passwords in it. We've taken it to the next level with our SpecOps password blacklist option for password policy. So we have a team of DevOps guys that monitors the hacking news groups and forums, and we download every new leak of a password database that's put onto those sites, and then we upload it to our blacklist database. And we currently have over 2 billion unique leaked passwords in that database. So, and I won't say it's 0-day protection because it does take us some time to download those files and decrypt them and check to see whether they already exist in the database or not, but it's as close as you can possibly be. So you can get to that statement that you see in the NIST recommendations where it says, you must make sure your users' passwords have never been compromised. You can get near enough there because we're doing that for you with SpecOps Password Blacklist. And of course, once we have that strong password or strong passphrase and we've checked it against our database, then we need to then we might be useful if we can allow users to self-reset. So we have another solution called SpecOps eReset, which uses lots of MFA to allow the user to prove their identity and reset their password from any device in any location. And they can use their fingerprint if they've got an Apple Touch ID, or their face if they've got Face ID on their phone, or Google Fingerprint if they've got an Android device with a fingerprint scanner. Plus all of the other more modern factors of authentication. So Google Authenticator, Microsoft Authenticator, Duo Security, Semantic VIP, they're all supported by eReset. So you're not stuck with, asking them what their favorite film was or the first record they bought. All of those sorts of things are easy to find out these days from social media. We can use those more secure factors that they use day in and day out for their own personal, Gmail account or Facebook account or whatever it might be, or even just logging into their iPhone or iPad, and use those technologies to authenticate the user in a much more secure way. So, what does our SpecOps Password Auditor look like? How difficult is it to use? So this is the free tool. I'm just going to, rather than showing you some slides, I'm just going to show you how easy it is to run. So you download this. We'll have a link for you at the end if you want to take a look at it. We install it on a workstation. It doesn't need to be installed on a domain controller. It does need to be run as a domain admin though. So we're going to click Start on here. It's going to go off and download our Blacklist Express database. Now, this isn't the full 2 billion words. It's 718 million, I believe, at the moment. We had a recent release a few days ago. So we've got 718 million password hashes in this database. It's 5 gigabytes in size, so you just need to make sure you've got that sort of amount of space on your C drive or on your local computer. And then what it will do is it will dump all of your users' existing password hashes and then compare it to the password hashes in our database. So we're not cracking anybody's password. You're not creating any risk as far as that's concerned. But on the next page, it will tell you how big a problem you've got in your environment. So this big red number at the top here, we have 68 blacklisted passwords in this database. Now, on the free version, these names are redacted, so you just get to see the headline number. But if you go on to become a password policy and a blacklist customer, you get the full product, which allows you to see all of the names. And again, you can drill into all of these reports. Look at that, our naughty administrator here has got a blacklisted password. That's not good. And another nice thing about this tool as well that we don't often consider is that a lot of people have multiple accounts within a single Active Directory these days. So you might have an admin account, you might have a regular user account. And I'm sure none of you guys have ever done it, but it has been known that some people set the same password for both accounts. So another side effect, or a nice side effect of this tool, is that it can also pull out identical passwords. So they might not be compromised, but it can detect duplicates. So again, if you've got some user management system or lifecycle management system that's generating lots of accounts for you, maybe new starters, and they've all got the same password, again, you can identify those sorts of risks as well, where you've got multiple accounts with all of the same passwords. And in fact, that's another nice feature of blank passwords as well. So a lot of organizations think, yeah, I've got a password policy in place. I won't have any users with blank passwords. Well, you may well have, because a blank password isn't dependent on the password policy. It's an attribute that is assigned to the AD account. And again, sometimes some of these user lifecycle management systems that bulk produce users forget to turn off the blank password attribute at the end of the user creation process. So this has opened a few eyes in the past when we've installed this solution. So very, very simple, tiny download apart from the actual database itself, but very, very telling. And again, you don't have to worry about having leaked passwords all over your desk. So you're not compromising anybody's password or cracking anybody's password with this tool. So yeah, I hope that was useful. I'm going to stop sharing now. And I'm going to skip these 2 slides. So yes, if you want to download Password Auditor, this is the link, and we'll be sending these slides out later, so you can have a quick look. Download the Auditor, download the database, and scan your own Active Directory. And obviously, get in touch with us if you want to talk a little bit more about it. Thanks very much for listening. I hope you found it interesting.
All right. Thank you, Darren. Thank you very much. And thank you again, Nick. Yeah, Darren, I like your concept of rewarding users for kind of going above and beyond.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's cool. They can keep them longer, keep them, forever, I guess, if they have a sufficiently complex. I like that.
Well, exactly that, and that's the whole point. It's because you will get pushback, like Nick was saying. They'll be up in arms, screaming, "Oh, you've made me type a 20-character password in. Like, I hate you forever." And you say, "Well, no. You can go for that shorter password. It's absolutely fine, but you're just going to have to change it a bit more frequently." But if you jump, and that 15-character minimum password limit is the key, because that's when the LAN-MAN hashing system breaks. And we can't, and it's no longer stored as a weak hash in your Active Directory, and where the NT hashes, which are much harder to crack, take over. So going from 14 characters to 15 characters might be very small in a regular user's eyes, but from an IT security perspective, it's a huge jump. Yeah. And again, building that huge reward in can make users make the right choices. So yeah, and that's what we offer.
That. Yeah, rewarding them for good behavior. It's good.
Absolutely, showing them the light.
Right. We've got some great audience questions here. I'll give you both a chance to chime in here. Let's start with you, Nick, on this one. What are your thoughts about not requiring a password reset unless an account has actually been compromised?
That's a bit of a loaded question, because the whole reason Microsoft killed the password recommendation was the thing I mentioned before, where people just simply appended a different number at the end of the password every time or something, and that becomes a real challenge. But so the recommendation generally today is don't bother doing it unless it's compromised. However, like I said during the presentation, I think that certain accounts that have more risk to them, it would benefit you to have the password changed frequently, and there's a couple reasons why. Going back to some things that Darren kind of talked about, he's talking about some different kinds of attacks. One of the methodologies of the attack is if I can gain access and get control over an endpoint, over a workstation, a laptop, something like that inside the organization, and I can get administrative rights to the workstation, I can use a tool like Mimikatz. If you haven't seen that, it's Mimikatz. Mimikatz is a command line version of a set of code that will scrape the RAM, and I can get password hashes, which can be used immediately in a pass-the-hash attack, and I can move laterally within an organization. They've got Kerberos tickets. You can use the rainbow tables and try and crack those. You even got clear text passwords. And so having, if it's an elevated account, changing the password every so often helps make sure that if there is anything stored in memory somewhere on a machine, that it's old and outdated and not usable. And then the other aspect here is I think of a Microsoft's stat that they've got. Their advanced threat protection page is the median number of days that an attacker sits on your network lying dormant without being detected. I shouldn't say lying dormant, sorry, without being detected, 146 days. She's talking 3.5 months or something, right? Almost 4 months, or 5 months, excuse me. And so if they're sitting on your network, think about how are they sitting on your network? They're sitting on the network because they've compromised credentials. So you may not even know that the credentials are compromised. That's why I would go, mailroom person, maybe not. Maybe you wait until you think they're compromised. But at the same time, someone with elevated risk, definitely recommended. And then, I don't know. I think the answer is really you find a balance. Darren, what do you think? You find a balance somewhere in the middle where you do recommend every once in a while they change, but not every 30 days, that kind of thing?
Exactly. I think if you can get over 15 characters, then you're looking good for probably 6 months to a year. I still recommend that admins change their passwords every 30 to 60 days tops. But everybody else maybe keep them for 6 months or a year of over 15 characters. But I never recommend password never expires, to be honest with you, because I could spend $20 on a keylogger from eBay and plug it into the back of your computer and Bluetooth your password to my phone. So, there are so many ways to get to take people's passwords. Again, this is why it's so important, really. If you've got MFA available, take it whatever it takes. But unfortunately, we're not quite there yet. So we're still stuck with passwords for the time being. So we need to make sure they're as good as we possibly can, as good as they can possibly be.
Yeah. Well, here it rolls nicely into this next question about MFA. This person asks, how do we do multi-factor authentication but with no cell phones and a voice over IP extension phone system? Still ways around that?
It depends on the solution. And again, it depends on what you're multi-factoring into. So if it's a multi-factor, let's say into a password reset solution, sure, you can still fall back to questions and answers. They're not the best in the world, but if you present them in the right way, so maybe they've had to pre-enroll with 3 questions about themselves. First of all, you don't show them all of the questions at once. You show them one question at a time. You don't allow them to use the same answer for all 3 questions. You do things like give them an amount of times to answer each question right, but if they exceed those that sort of lockout period, they have to contact the self-service. They have to contact the service desk like they used to. Stuff like that. With regards to actually logging into the workstation itself, again, you've got to look for maybe federated services. A bit like, again, what Nick mentioned earlier. Log into Facebook. I guess people may have seen it if they've got Spotify accounts. You don't have to create a Spotify account. You can log in with your Facebook ID.
Sure.
And that seems really convenient. But what they're actually using in the background is they're trusting Facebook to prove that you are who you say you are. It's a bit like when exactly. So you can log into these other third-party organizations, and then you're trusting them. But of course, then you're relying on that third-party organization security. So it's whether you trust them or not. That's the key thing. But there are lots of options out there. And you have got still things like RSA tokens and other things like that. But of course, they all cost money. I much prefer the free RSA token, if you like, in Google Authenticator or Microsoft Authenticator, those sorts of things. But I understand that there are call center environments, for instance, where you don't want people to have access to mobile phones, or highly secure areas where you don't want people to have access to mobile phones. Another nice non-mobile factor feature that we use in our password reset solution is manager identification as well. And we often see this in use at schools and colleges. So rather than if a student forgets their password, they can say, ask my manager, who might be their teacher, let's say, to verify them. The teacher knows who they are, but the teacher gets an email or a text saying, can you verify that Darren has just forgotten his password? Hey, Darren, have you just sent me this request? Yes, I have. Okay. Yeah, I'll give you a star. I will authenticate you on your behalf. Sure. So that's another way to do it. But again, it really depends on what you're trying to authenticate against and whether that platform supports these non-mobile factors.
Non-mobiles, yeah. Nick, anything you want to add to that? I know you definitely have some strong feelings about MFA.
Actually, no, other than I just staying on the topic of multi-factor, even though the question was about we have VoIP phones and so on, Darren sort of, I'm inferring from your response, Darren, that you were kind of insinuating maybe mobile phones were not allowed in that location or so on. But even if they are, I'm not a huge fan of using SMS, anything that where someone's SIM card can be spoofed. There's been some recent attacks where spear phishing attacks against every major cellular carrier in order to basically try to gain access to their application, whatever it's called internally, that does the SIM swap. So rather than try to social engineer a SIM swap, going, I'm Darren, even though obviously I don't have a British accent and so on, but I'm Darren and I forgot it. Can you help me? And I don't remember what it is. My wife has it, but and you try and get your way in. Forget that. You're just going to go and access the application and just change out Darren's SIM for a bad guy controlled phone, and we're done.
Yeah.
So think of just stay away from that if you can. I'd rather like Darren said, the free stuff, the online stuff, the things that are out of band are all really good ideas.
Yep. Sounds good. Now, this next question, I know we've touched on this a little bit throughout the conversations today. Are there any guidelines that can be provided to users so they can avoid blacklisted passwords?
That's again a big question. There are so many of them. I mean, I go back to the UK government's recommendation: 3 random words that mean something to you and nothing to anybody else. So if you think of the first car you ever bought, the first school you went to, your mother's maiden name, they're 3 words that are very easy for you to remember, very easy for you to type. But if you were to type in "May the Force be with you" or "We all live on the yellow submarine," they're already been leaked, so they're no good. But those 3 random words are, I think, a great first step. They're likely they're likely very weak words individually, but the fact that you've used 3 of them together and separated them by spaces or dots or dashes or whatever, you could add that in as well. That's what makes them strong. But I think that's the best. That's the best kind of sentence that I've seen from a government organisation about how to come up with a good, strong password / passphrase.
Sure. Okay. Nick, anything you wanted to...
I agree. I'm just going to more broadly generalize Darren's answer. I think instead of focusing on trying to provide guidelines of what not to do, because that's the how many bad passwords do you have in your database again, Darren?
Just 2 billion, only a few.
Okay, that's the $2 billion. That's the 2 billion. Long. Here's a list of passwords not to use. Right. That's no one's going to do that.
Yeah, you can't do that. No.
No, just give them guidelines on what you want to see out of it, and something as simple as the UK recommendations that Darren's talking about, or if you have your own inside of an organization. If you tell them that, then at least there is something that the user can then adhere to and go, okay, I can do that. Because it also helps eliminate even like my ludicrous example of a sentence, and I know we're almost out of time, so I'll be as brief as I can. If you just had the guideline of saying, please write a at least 15-character regularly formed English sentence, that's going to frustrate users. They're not. I don't know what's a good sentence, what's a secure sentence. I don't know. But something as simple as what Darren's talking about, whether it's that specific recommendation or not, but something that simple for a user to digest, understand, and then execute on, that's the secret.
Nice and simple and basic, indeed. All right. Well, that is about all the time we have for today. I'd like to give a huge thanks to Nick Cavalancia and Darren James for your presentations today. We've covered some really great stuff, got some good strategies and tactics and action items for our listeners to take back. I want to thank those of you in the audience for attending this webcast, and thanks also to SpecOps for their sponsorship. Thanks again, everyone, for listening in, and enjoy the rest of your day. And this concludes
have a good day, guys.
webcast. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.